mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Chad Abel, and I just wanted to welcome you to our latest installment of our webinar series for ACLS. Today we have Paul Barabeau. He is an architect and former Lutheran minister. He is going to be presenting today a door, an exploration of the significance of portal in liturgical journey. And Paul has a really interesting presentation. And from this point, at first, before I turn it over to Paul, just a couple of reminders about the way that this works. If you have any questions along the way, you can type your questions into the question box, and then if you would like to raise your hand, you can by clicking the little raise hand button in the control panel, and I can unmute your microphone and you can ask the question directly at that point, but we will hold all the questions until the end. So I guess with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chad. I will assume everyone can hear me and see the presentation, and I'll just begin now. So, as Chad said, I'm an architect by training. I'm also a former pastor. Back long ago when I started my formal education, I actually was a long way away from my profession as an architect. I started out as a physics major, and very quickly I was lured away from math and science to the study of rhetoric, and I ended up in my undergraduate degree as a classics major. One of the things that I brought with me to the study of religion and to the study of architecture from the study of linguistics was an appreciation for the structure of language. We tend to think that language is all about words, and that's true enough. Words are a part of it. But what is fascinating for me about language is the way in which words themselves are connected to form poetry and sentences and composition and to provide movement. And that connection of words is called syntax. That is, it is the way that words gain meaning, not in and of themselves, but in relationship to each other, to other words. Let me give you an example. We all know what the word good and the word bad generally mean. When you put them together, it changes the meaning of good. So a good person is good and a bad person is bad. And if somebody is good and bad, it doesn't mean that they are both good and bad. It means that they are really, really bad. The fascinating thing about language and composition is not the words themselves, but rather how we space the words, where we put the words in relationship to each other. That's composition and movement of thought. It's the language and the combination and spaces between words, not the syntax of the words, that bring meaning to proclamation. It's actually not that different from architectural composition. We tend to think of architecture as building materials or architectural spaces that we inhabit, and that's true. But the composition of architecture is not just the building blocks of architecture, the brick and mortar, if you will, or the spaces that they create. It's how the building blocks are arranged. It is the space between spaces. As Mies van der Rohe said, God is in the details. It's not just about the materials, it is how they go together. So also with architectural spaces themselves. We inhabit space, and those spaces bring us delight, but the architectural journey is also about the interrelationship of spaces. That is, the connection between rooms or the connections between the places we inhabit. For me, the fascinating thing about the journey through spatial sequence is how those places are connected, how they sequence themselves to bring meaning to the journey, and the point at which you transition from one place to another. A fascinating thing is the space between the spaces. And this brings me to my fascination with portal or doorway or threshold. As a liturgical designer, this is especially significant because, of course, the liturgy itself is really an unfolding journey. So let me give some context to this line of thinking. Historic architecture is littered with examples of prominent portal, not only the common portals of dwellings and buildings, but significant portal structures. Throughout history, civilizations have built monuments, generally to commemorate passage or achievement or conquest. So, for instance, we have in Rome history of various conquests enthroned into archways. The Arch of Titus, which is the oldest remaining archway in the Roman Forum, commemorating the conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And we also have, as a great example, the Arch of Constantine from 315, the first Christian emperor. In modern times, we have continued this tradition, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris from 1836, commemorating Napoleon's conquest, and the Arch de Fraternité, or the Le Grand Arch de la Défense, excuse my pronunciation of French, from 1898, which was a modern representation of the arch commemorating the advance of humanity rather than war. And even in this country, we have Washington Arch, one of the famous arches in the country, in New York City, which was actually from 2 centuries ago in 1892. Arches can convey wonderful things, good things, like the Brandenburg Tors in Berlin, entry into a spatial promenade in Germany, and they can also represent more weighty or tragic things, for instance, the entrance to Auschwitz. We mark our places, our spaces, with portal. And perhaps the oldest example, or one of the oldest remaining examples, is actually Stonehenge, which is a series of portals into a sacred space used by people long since gone away. Art also has used the concept of portal. Perhaps one of the best known is The Gates of Hell by Auguste Rodin from 1880 to 1917. It actually took him quite a bit of time to create the piece. And religious architecture as well. And the arts of architecture in the church has used the doors of expression. Again, a famous example of this are the baptistry doors at Florence's St. John's in the Piazza del Duomo, with its 3 bronze doors, or 3 bronze sets of doors. This is one of them, dubbed by Michelangelo as the Gates of Paradise. These doors are beautifully illustrated, as much so as any art glass window in any church. And of course, architecture itself, apart from the arts within architecture, also has celebrated the door. For example, the famous King's Portal at Notre Dame. a beautiful expression of entry reserved for dignitaries and symbolic procession. The writings and the architecture of the Judeo-Christian tradition are also full of symbolic, if not literal, portal. It's easy to see why the church has celebrated portal in its history, apart from just the need for portal within architecture. The most foundational of these in the Jewish tradition is the portal of the Hebrews in Egypt that's pivotal in their deliverance from bondage, followed by then crossing transitions further through the Sea of Reeds out of Egypt and through the desert, and eventually the crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land 40 years later under the leadership of Joshua. In the Christian tradition, doors also play an important, prominent role, the open tomb perhaps being an early Christian Arc de Triomphe. And I would call to mind that the cross itself is a portal, though it may not often be thought of in this regard. But the illusion in the minds of the biblical witness is clear. The blood of the firstborn lamb smeared on the doorways of the Hebrew dwellings in Egypt returns in the final act of deliverance on the cross. And the cross itself is, in fact, a literal doorway. Traditional threshold architecture having both post and lintel construction. The vertical post of the cross and the horizontal lintel of the cross. The connection can't be more clear. Now, if we understand the celebration of liturgy as the journey of God's people, as a pathway commemorating and experiencing our story of deliverance and salvation, we can understand a number of prominent markers in our space along the way. There is, of course, the font, often talked about as a portal or a transition into the ritual space. We also have a prominent place for ambo and a prominent place for altar as well. And these are all clear, prominent places on the liturgical journey. But the church has also marked the journey of liturgy with additional portals, not all of them still in use, but other places inside the building that heighten our sense of movement by creating portal. One of those is, for instance, the proscenium arch. It is that triumphal-like archway that moves people from the nave into the sanctuary or the altar platform behind it. It really is a threshold of sorts between one space and another, often necessary for the architecture of the building, but also strategically placed. Beyond the sanctuary platform or the altar platform, very often we find secondary arches or triumphal arches of a different sort that lead us beyond the liturgy and celebrate often the triumphal kingship of the Christ. The rood screen, a strange, the history of these things is amazing. This is actually such a beautiful example of a rood screen, although difficult to understand how it makes connection between the worshiper and the altar even possible. But a portal of sorts that was meant to limit access. to the sanctuary platform and to the altar. The baldacchino is of sorts a marker of place, perhaps a little less portal-like than we typically think, but nevertheless marking place and defining area. And this is from St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Very grand and somewhat portal-like, although not quite like a doorway. My favorite is the Lich Gate. For those of you that aren't familiar with that tradition, primarily an Anglican tradition, but the entryway into the churchyard, very often to a cemetery along the road, and it is here that the bodies of the awaiting burial were placed, protected before they were buried, and people could come by and visit them before they moved into the official burial place of surrounding the church. All these features, however valuable or not we find them now, do celebrate a movement of people through the spaces of architecture, marking place, marking transitions, and even along the ritual journey, marking the procession of people from the secular to the sacred. So within this, I think there are some opportunities for current design, either new design or renovation, to bring depth to the experience of the Christian architecture that we use for both hospitality and worship. Let me show you a few examples. So we can talk about Portal as an opportunity for understanding entry or invitation for the world. Here's an example of a church that has quite a few different portals. There is the main ceremonial doors, which are oversized, not great for exit path, and also a canopy which leads to doors alongside of this that are much more functional and human scale doors. But this particular client wanted to create a strong sense of invitation to people that were passing by on roadways near the church, and also parking in what is a fairly substantial church parking lot. So these doors can be opened on a Sunday morning as a symbolic welcoming, as well as a functional portal when they're open. Similarly, this church, while not actually creating a strong presence of door on the outside of the building, previously did not have great exposure to passing by traffic alongside the church building. And when they built their new church, they decided that they wanted to open up both their hospitality space, which are the doors on the right, and also their worship space, which are the sequence of windows lined then with the reclaimed windows from their original worship space, as a way of providing welcome into hospitality and also welcome into worship. And of course then also match that with a beacon at the top of the church as a way of calling people from farther away to worship. Presence becomes an opportunity for these exterior places of Portal. These have the possibility of providing greater presence of the church to the surrounding community. They can also, depending on how they're designed, provide a sense of invitation or access, and particularly, I think, the church in the lower right-hand corner, by opening this up with glass and not closing it off with wood, provides a strong sense of invitation to people driving by the church. The doors also on the exterior have the potential of making a statement about who is welcome. You'll notice in both of these examples, there are no steps up to the doors. The grandeur of the entry is done not with steps, but with the size and the scale and the quality of the portal piece. And in fact, in the upper right-hand corner, the upper left-hand corner, that sense of accessibility is even further conveyed by the canopy itself, which provides shelter for people that might otherwise be susceptible to the elements. And I think these portal entries also speak to the quality of the journey that lies beyond them. If the portal is significant, if it is beautiful, if it has quality in material and artistry, what it does is suggest to people that the journey beyond those doors is equally fine and worthy of effort to move into the space. Good example, Lonnie Israel did a presentation on the Cathedral of the Light not too long ago and gave a fascinating discussion about the building, and particularly the design of the doors and the craft and the care that went into the design of the handles of the doors. That level of detail speaks volumes about the quality of the space that lies beyond. And of course, one of my favorites is the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles, the doors of which are finely crafted, but the portal surrounding it also beautiful, prominent, compelling, inviting people to move beyond the exterior into the interior of the space. Doors and portals also, once you're in the building, can accentuate the movement from common public spaces to more private spaces, particularly the worship space. This is a church that has a fairly large gathering space and a well of light coming down into that space. And the doors into worship, which you can see on the far end, are scaled so that they command attention once you are in the space. And of course, the scale of those gives an indication of the grandeur of the space that lies beyond. A little more finely refined than the gathering space, but nevertheless part of the journey, and the doors actually anticipate or heighten the sense of movement from the space of gathering into the place of worship. That church I showed you previously with the glass into worship and the glass into hospitality. Similarly, inside the building, they do have a set of oversized doors between gathering space and worship. These doors are about 9 feet by 11 feet, somewhere in that magnitude. You can see the scale of the doors. Now, just to the right of these doors are a series of 3 portals, double-door portals, that lead also between gathering and worship, but nobody ever makes that journey. These are the grand doors, the doors that everyone wants to enter the building through. These are the doors that actually bring people into a worship space, and not only that, but the strength of the doors is necessary because, as you can see from this photo, there is a volume of the building that is different from the liturgical axis leading from the door up to the altar. The strength of the backdrop to the altar platform, along with the strength of the entry doors, helps to support a liturgical axis that's different from the volume, the axial volume of the building. These doors, interior to the building, have the potential of clarifying the hierarchy of the building. In other words, you wouldn't expect a worship door to be the same as a door into a conference room or into an educational area of the building. They can beckon entry, so the size and the scale and the grandeur of the door can actually call people from the space. And what I particularly like about the larger doors is when they are closed, they heighten the anticipation of entry. I recall many years ago, I'll show you a picture of St. Anne's Church in Pleasant Prairie. It's one of the first churches I worked on with a set of large doors between gathering and worship. The church was a new building. The congregation was worshiping some half a block away at a school, and they processed all the way to those entry doors. And as you approached the doors, you could see the worship space through glass areas surrounding the doors, but the doors themselves were shut. Overscaled, oversized, beautiful doors. And as they opened, there was just a sense of awe and majesty moving along the liturgical path and having to wait for the grand doors to open, heightening that sense of anticipation, in addition to welcome, I think is both worthy of the portal between gathering and worship. That entry into worship also is a backdrop for the things that are inside worship. This is a church just north of Madison, Wisconsin, a very large Catholic church. As you can see by the space itself is overwhelming, and the articulation of the architecture is animated. The font in front of it, which has both a basin component and a source component, needed to be scaled differently than the architecture surrounding it. And the doors, the grand doors behind the font, not only provided that portal from gathering into worship, but also provided a suitable backdrop and helped to focus attention. So the contrast of the white marble carved and animate in the source font is contrasted to the dark, rich wood of the doors behind it. I believe, if I recall correctly, that's Sapele wood. And it brings then scale for the immediate encounter of the baptismal font when people enter the space. The font itself is large, but would be lost within the architecture without a backdrop that could focus attention and provide contrast and less animation, because the font itself is relatively animated. This project is actually a church, a 1950s Lutheran church, that turned its worship. It used to run, as most churches did at that time, in a long, narrow space. The existing worship space, apart from being tunnel-like, had a fire in the 1970s, and when they redesigned the church, it became even more tunnel-like. And about 5 years ago, they turned the worship space. Now, the challenge for the congregation, who was used to having a strong axis down a tunnel, a very long axis, about 25 pews, if I recall correctly, was in turning the worship through that space. The space itself was very shallow. Those of you who are liturgical or architectural designers for churches will understand one of the no-nos that we encounter is the bridal party wanting to have the longest possible promenade through the space. Turning the worship space was a source of dismay for a few people in this church. Adding to that problem was the structure of the building itself, and the church had budget to remove the arches that, or the structure that came down into what is now the chancel space, or the altar platform of the space, but they did not have budget to remove the arches on the opposite side of the space. Initially we tried to do that, but of course that became difficult with the budget, and so we decided that we had to allow the arches to stay. And we wrestled with that quite a bit as we realized that we weren't going to be able to achieve the initial goal. And instead what we found was that this became an opportunity to in fact strengthen the axis crosswise through the space. And that was done by allowing those arches to in fact then hold something of significance for the space that made them not simply functional for the architecture, but functional for the celebration of liturgy. And so in between the doors from gathering to worship, which could not be grand because of the existing architecture, people encounter the font and then are further reminded that they are transitioning into different space through the incorporation of this lintel between the existing columns. And from the entry side, it really frames the cross over from a public space into a public space that is now reserved specifically for worship. In addition to shortening the main axis or axes through the worship space, we also had to confront some concern for the fact that the grand entry window behind their altar, which you'll see in a moment and has a very nice cross on the outside of the building that is visible through that window, when we put up the lintel piece through these arches, the threshold here actually blocked the threshold there. So the entry end of the building and the lintel actually blocked the view of the final portal on that liturgical path. And that caused some people quite a bit of dismay until we, as a committee, helped people understand that what we were actually doing was allowing that expression of the final cross for the space to be reflected in the font, but not experienced directly until people passed through the font area and beyond that portal that marked the baptistry. And the lintel then actually served as a feature to draw people into the space, to have them move beyond font into the full understanding of the space that lay beyond it. And that window, of course, functions now as an entry into the world. So previously this church had been cut off from the street. They are on a prominent boulevard in their town. The church had very little presence. One of the things that we did to accentuate that was to add a gable, cross gable in the building, which allowed their building to read more strongly, but also this portal at the backdrop of their chancel and the cross to provide both invitation to the street, because their entry is in the back the back side of the building off of the street, we felt we had to have some kind of expression of doorway or portal for people out where the public would be drawn into the building. And as chance would have it, they happened to have a beautiful tree just beyond, almost on axis, that then provides a framework and a shield for light filtering into the worship space. And so the cross through this lintel. So we have the lintel, or the portal of the window. We have the portal of the cross, and then a beautiful tree that also helps mark the place in the public sphere. And this is what that cross looked like. Interestingly enough, none of this liturgical design was fully established. The architecture, the sequence of the space, the window, all of that was understood. But it wasn't until we had to solve the problem of the structure that the liturgical symbolism of places on this journey started to take form. The lintel itself has a curved front. It's designed out of wood. That curve was also used in the ambo and in the altar to form crosses and portals in those pieces. And then on the outside of the building, you can see that lintel reestablishes itself on the exterior of the building. It is sparkle on the building along with the window. The arms of this corpus invite people, draw people, gather people, welcome them, and at the same time for people inside the space, the arms of this cross leading back out into the space beckon people to follow back out into the world. The cross gathers and it sends. Exactly what the church is called to do. Another final example, this is St. Anne's Catholic Church in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. And this is that church that had the procession up to their grand entry doors. They're not seen in this photo, but you can see we carried on that sense of portal also into the baptistry. So the place of the font, the place of initiation, is marked by the doors entering into the space, as well as an archway that leads into the nave. In the font itself, those doors, those wood doors that open between gathering and worship, are now refashioned over the pool. So people can walk over this bridge, same wood, the same material, having passed through the doors into the baptistry. Now they can pass over the baptistry on the same type of material that they came into the space on. And that threshold is also marked back behind the altar, which becomes a beacon to the outside, as well as a reminder that what happens in the celebration of the liturgy changes us for ministry back into the world. This was one of the illustrations that was used to help people understand that sense of liturgical procession from the entry threshold and the grand doors through the baptistry to the place of the word, down a ramp and through a place of honor, up to the sanctuary platform and the ceremonial ramp that leads up to it, and then finally to the transcendence window, or the portal that moves beyond the celebration of the Mass back out into the world, changed people by the experience in worship. And on the outside of the building, again, this portal piece calls people, draws people in. Fascinating to me was while the building was under construction, not that people aren't fascinated by the construction of a building, but every day as the building was going up, once this portal was framed and the building was enclosed, there was a stream of cars that would pass by during the lunch hour while people were on their lunch break, lining up to have a chance to see through this portal into the church as it was being constructed. It's exactly the experience that people and the designers hoped for, that in fact this portal would compel the surrounding area of Pleasant Prairie. They're about 2 blocks away from a major highway through the town. This is visible. The hope is that people would be compelled by this opening to experience the church, understand the proclamation of the church, and be drawn inside to become a part of the family. All of these things and more, I think, are possible on the journey. It's a matter of how we understand, how we sequence our spaces, how we articulate the movement from place to place, and how we understand marking the transition from one state of being to another, from one place to another, from outside to inside, from public to private. So with that, I'd like to turn it over if there are questions or points of discussion.
Let's see. I don't have any questions at the moment. If anyone has a question, I'd appreciate it if you just type them in, or you could click the raise your hand button, and would allow you to be able to ask the question yourself. I didn't have a question. I just had an observation. I thought I forget the name of the project, but the project that had the where the axis was turned from a very linear axis to a crossways axis. I think that was just a really great example of just good design sensibility. It's kind of an interesting thing that I think that whenever we have it's almost like the more hemmed in you are, the more creative the design can be. And I just thought it was a really good example of that, and I really appreciated the level of attention that you guys paid to the different layers of information. And so I just thought it was a really good project.
Well, in fact, I often tell my clients the best architecture comes out of the most difficult challenges.
Yeah.
If the canvas is too easy, I don't think we end up with quite as rich an experience as when we wrestle with challenges.
Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
It is.
Let's see, I do have a question from Sister Marilyn Morgan. What kind of formation do you give to the committee to discuss the importance of thresholds and portals?
It depends on the project, but one of the things I try to do fairly early on, and understand very often when I work, we have a liturgical consultant that has already prepped a church or a building committee for understanding many of these sorts of things and the movement of liturgy. But I think as we become involved then with the architecture, it's helpful for us to kind of help people understand how architecture works structurally without getting into too much detail, but really helping them see the opportunities like this of how doorways and structure within the space can actually add to the sequence of liturgy. In fact, this is an excellent example of if I can go back to these pictures, the drama of the space that might have existed at one point when the building was built, after the fire, when they decided to lighten the building and just paint everything white and line it with beautiful fluorescent tube lights, the drama was gone. And for liturgy, I think the sequence of our spaces is incredibly important. We have to have a sequence of movement. It was difficult to go to this particular client and say, I want to paint your deck blue, dark blue, and then float panels, and by actually bringing down the ceiling lower, we're going to create more of a sense of it being higher. But that's in fact what happened, is the drama of the space returned. And a lot of that was kind of the skeleton of the building and celebrating the structure in a way that the previous renovation had not been able to do. But I rely very heavily on liturgical consultants for helping people understand that liturgy is not about watching, it's about participating, it's about moving, it's about procession and journey.
Right, right. Jim Hunt had a question. Do ceremonial doors wider than 4 foot not count as required exits?
What we typically do, I haven't really broached that formally with the code. I avoid having them be a part of the exit egress pathway out of the worship space, primarily because I do not want an exit sign directly above them. And in fact, by having them large enough that they will not be mistaken by building inspectors as a part of the exit path, it gets us out of the insistence that above every portal in a worship space we have to have an exit light. If in fact the door has difficulty functioning as an easy exit, it in the minds of the electrical inspector or the building inspector that's signing off on the building is not going to probably prompt an exit light. So I haven't really tried to make them a part of the exit path, but I think it is difficult the larger they get to understand, primarily because of the ease of pushing the doors, although in my experience I've found with the right hardware and the right design, it is not any more difficult opening these doors than it really is to open most doors in a church building.
But it does limit
and
your.
If it were,
it kind of limits your use of hardware as well as the exit light kind of issue as well.
Exactly, and I have given some thought at one point. I wasn't sure if we would have to counterbalance the doors in order to get them to open with ease, but in my experience I haven't found that that's the case. They probably do not meet ADA pull standards for how easy it has to be in order to pull a door open, but I think as long as there are other pathways that are easily accessible alongside of it, the church doors are often at the time that people are entering and exit the church, usually in a state of being held open anyway.
Kind of an extension from Jim's question is, do you still call them doors or something else that may be related to how they're called out on the drawings to give the code official some hint as to where you're going?
You'll notice here I often either have something that will say threshold doors. I sometimes refer to them as ceremonial doors. I actually didn't use the word ceremonial in this example because these doors happen to be normal size before the font, and it's the lintel that is really the ceremonial threshold into the worship space. But typically they go into our door schedule, but they often are not articulated on the plans. I tend to treat the ceremonial doors less as a feature of the architecture and more a feature of the liturgical furnishing design. So as the altar, the ambo, the processional cross, the crucifix in the space, the font are all developed as furnishings. I like to have the ceremonial doors also designed with those pieces in mind. In my mind, it is more a work of art in the architecture than an architectural feature, and it should be designed as a part of the liturgical furnishings and the sequence of liturgical furnishings in the space. So very often we don't actually show the doors or the hardware, which probably it hasn't seemed to have been a problem in getting buildings approved, as long as there are adequate formal entry doors and exit doors to satisfy the code.
Robert Haviger actually asked a question off of Jim's question. One of the challenges for main doors are the code exit requirements. Have you adjusted to accommodate these situations? I think maybe you already covered that.
Yeah, again, we try to not have the ceremonial doors a part of the exit sequence, primarily because we don't want building inspectors to require us to put an exit light above the doors, because they are such a strong visual focus, especially in churches where the font is immediately inside these doors.
Right. Ken Griesmer asks, Paul, thanks for a great presentation. Would you talk a bit more about the relationship between the various portals and the liturgical procession?
Sure, and this is the slide I have up here, I think is a great example of we have, apart from the entry into the building, we have the entry from gathering into the baptistry, and this was actually a lower area of the church. This area right around the font had a different roof line and was not all immediate to the original building. The long and narrow church had a transept over here, but it did not have this portion of building, which was added with the addition of the educational space sometime later. But this entry is fairly restricted, and again gave us an opportunity to provide the enclosure between the doors and the lintel for the font. So this area is actually not large. It's in and of itself is a fairly restricted threshold from gathering into worship. And then on the main pathway, we chose to use that lintel design. The lintel is what started it, but the font itself contains components that are similar to the lintel. And then the altar itself, I can go over to an image, I think, of the altar. The altar itself has a lintel component similar to the lintel at the entryway, as does the ambo, but used in different, you can see that lintel here on 4 pedestals supporting legs. The altar, it's a little hard to see in this image, but it is a horizontal under the main table, the top of the table in the altar. We talked about this piece being a cross-like element. It actually has 2 components that is underneath a maple top. So it's almost as if there is a cross that is horizontally marking the space of the altar and then covered with a clean wood pall. And then behind that we have this lintel that provides scale, and then the lintel of the window, moving people beyond worship into the world, and then finally the cross, which is visible from inside and from outside, and does contain also those curved pieces, although it's not done in wood. What I find interesting is, if we understand that is the entire liturgical journey, In other words, moving from the exterior of the building to the exterior of the building through worship. So coming in from the world, being changed by the experience of community inside the building, and then moving back out into the world. This pathway from cross to entry doors is actually longer than the original processional down the long, narrow church. I think all of those are important for understanding, and had I been able to, I might have tried. This entry was already existing. I might have tried to line that up on the entry. There is, in fact, a window at the end of that axis, so as you enter the building, you do have a sense for a fairly long journey from light to light at the far ends. And I think all of those places have to be articulated and celebrated as a part of movement, even if that journey is officially relatively short.
Right.
This church has a stronger expression of a long axis. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I think it did. I had one more question, and I actually think it's a really good one. To preface it, I'll kind of preface it with my own statement, I guess. But, you know, we've talked a lot about more programming in these spaces and how these whole things come about. We've not talked a lot about the specific aesthetic direction. And so John Bergstrom asked the question, in architectural design, how much emphasis is given to, oh, I'm sorry, he said acoustics, but I was reading aesthetics before, which is kind of an interesting direction, and I guess maybe we'll ask that question, and then the question about acoustics. I read the question wrong. I'm sorry about that.
Sure, I think it has to be a part of uncovering the building. This is probably an easier sense for talking about aesthetics because it's an existing building, that a lot of the color choices, a lot of the design of the building was actually solving problems in an existing space that did not work liturgically. St. Anne's in Pleasant Prairie might be a little better example, where the aesthetics of the building, the shape of the building, was determined by how they chose to arrange themselves. This happens to be an antiphonal space, and the surrounding aesthetic of Pleasant Prairie is, you know, this is in Wisconsin on the prairie, and there is a strong desire to see things or connect with prairie style. And that was on the plate relatively early on, and so you start to see features in this space that echo some of the arts and crafts, early arts and crafts movement, because that's kind of the aesthetic of the surrounding landscape here. In all of these examples, of course, the volume of the building, definitely acoustics has to come into play very early on. In fact, I think the acoustic designer has to be on board before the building starts to take shape, so that the shape itself can accentuate the architecture. In that church that turned itself, of course, challenge for the acoustic designer is we could not put music on the short axis through the space, and for this particular church that wasn't a problem. The former altar platform area actually had the organ behind it and the choir behind the altar platform, and that's part of why that space didn't work. But we retained that location as the music center for the space, even though it isn't completely proximate to the chancel space, because it was on the long end of the acoustic axis of the building, and it was hard to imagine that they could place the chancel crossways through that volume, or the music center crossways through that volume. It's just not the way that sound works.
Right. Well,
it may actually work for contemporary music a little better than it would for a traditional sacred choir.
Right. Right. Well, good. Look, I wanted to thank you. It's looks like we're out of time, but it's been a really interesting presentation. I thought it was presented very well, and also I just thought that you did a great job. So thank you for taking the time to put it together. Thank you for taking the time to put it together and sharing with us. So just everybody, you know, we're going to have another webinar scheduled soon. The invitation will come out. And as always, if anyone is interested in putting together a presentation or giving a topic, please email me. My name's Chad Abel. It's chad@acdarchitects.com. And we'd love to be able to have you put together a presentation and present to everyone else. So with that, I thank everybody and see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Chad.